Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming. So I'm Joe. I teach composition here.
I'm Mitch. I'm the Director of Adult Education, Faculty, and Instruction, and I'm also a writing instructor at DePaul University.
So, in background, Mitch and I met each other in grad school when we were in a rhetoric and writing program at DePaul. So we were talking about this before we ever knew which one was writing. So.
That's right.
Wow. There's a lot of people in this room I don't know, so could we just kind of go around? Could you say your name and what you teach?
Sure. Nancy Copat. I work with the GED process for language arts.
Hi, I'm Kate Morrissey, and I'm also with Nancy, with GED language arts.
Oh, it's me, Gretchen Reyes, business management.
Angela Staunton, education classes.
Glenn Kahn, business.
Sarah Sears, business.
Christopher Clem, culinary.
Louis Apple, anatomy, physiology, science.
Rafael Shabazzi, math department. Christine Reyes, sciences.
Holborn, Capitol Librarian.
Leslie Gottlinger, education.
Holly Williams, education.
Welcome, welcome. This is actually really exciting because this room represents so many parts of the college, meaning so many different kinds of writing. So I hope we can have some good conversation about what that is in our disciplines.
Yeah. So these are kind of our goals for the hour and a half we're going to spend together. We're going to very briefly review the research on response to student writing. Believe it or not, there is really a plethora of research on this topic. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time providing some concrete practical guidelines for commenting on your students' writing. And then at the end, very briefly, we're going to talk about some different tools that you can use to provide comments on your student writing. So that's kind of where we're headed. So, go ahead.
First, some questions for you, because I feel like there's so much knowledge in this room as people who respond to student writing. So I'm just going to throw these out, and I'm hoping to hear from you all and we can have a discussion. So first of all, when you're responding to your students' writings, what are your goals, or sort of what are your purposes? How do you consider that? What's your process? Like, where are you? What do you do as you're commenting? And then what kind of strategies do you use that work for you?
So if you guys kind of want to talk amongst yourselves, kind of share with one another, and then we'll come back together and we'll kind of share it.
Okay.
Love to hear from you.
Yeah, come on in.
Okay. Sure. I mean, I asked him to give her my
I take on first time. They have opening their need yet.
Yeah. So how do you, what did you comment on all those things? Make sure.
If I can make sense of it, I allow it.
Yeah.
I struggle though.
Do you circle it? Okay. So you can mark it. Right.
I was more important.
Right, the context. That's how, right.
So they are very communicative.
So you're looking for other content
So do you do comments on that? So if it's not grammatically correct, you write comments in
I give mine. You have this
What about for you?
Yeah, that's actually what I was trying to talk about, focusing on what trigger signs, as well as the pressure to respond to all of them.
Correct spelling, and I think we just put this. I did that where writing is really so well. The other day, they're saying, was it a girl who said, a student here, and then she kind of up twice, now you I don't think so, but I write it longer, I made that correction. So I ran all of those. Get it back to me. I didn't have no idea how that was anyway.
Okay, so you do take off.
Well, I mean, that's all I always just.
At a certain point, you know,
Are you? Okay.
There are several areas.
Right, so you're looking for the comments right there.
Oh my God, you're the worst.
Like they show her all the time market, I just hope to the process. All right, folks, let's come back all together. And I'm just excited to hear some of the insights. What are some of the interesting things that came out at your team? Wow. But I know that when you go to education school, something wrong with education, they talk about wait time, right? Like when you ask a question, you have to be comfortable with the awkwardness until someone's ready to speak. So practicing wait
Go ahead,
time.
Nancy. Hey, like that. I'm not shy. Pat and I, we pretty much do the same thing. After talking to her right now, I realize that we're pretty much on the same level. Doesn't make it great, but it means we're there. But we were just talking about using different types of rubrics based on what we're, because teaching GED, we're doing different things, so we need different types of rubrics. And I was talking about commenting. I like to give lots of comments to my students, and I give almost entirely positive. I never dwell on the negative. I just say I'm going to come and talk to you individually and just point out things to them. And
So you do your kind of constructive negative comments individually?
Individual.
Like you verbalize them to the students?
yes,
So your written comments are only
I might
positive.
say, you need some practice on commas, but I want to come and talk to you about it. Okay, rather than saying, hey, there's about 1,000 different commas in here that don't belong here. I do it that way. And the other thing, I know that they say you're not supposed to put a lot of red on papers, but I do. And I just tell my students, the more red means the more time I took and care about you. Otherwise, if I didn't care, you would see no red on your paper. Okay, so red means love. Red is love. The more red, that means I took this time. That's it.
Sharon.
I've got a comment to the red. I grew up, mother was an English teacher. I can't tell you how much English grammar I had after hours. But when I was in 5th grade, I went away to camp for the summer. And at the end of that summer, I stopped writing letters to my mom.
Oh, because she corrected them.
She corrected one of the letters that I wrote in red and sent it back to me at camp.
Oh, my God.
And I don't use red.
What do you use? Green?
I use what
I use green.
Use green, yeah.
Marking pen or
Purple.
purple or
Oh,
something.
oh,
That's what I
you
do.
do.
Yeah, no red. No red.
Well, one of the reasons I use red is because I buy erasable red pens. So if I make a mistake, I can erase it because I didn't, and then I can change it. I hear you though, once I write it down.
I'm not erasing.
I got it.
Other strategies, practices, processes that came up.
Well, I'm not an English teacher, I'm not a writing teacher, but I'm a science teacher. So, when you have some good things like, or discuss the body, human body, we talk about the muscular system. And there's a term that's used in the muscular system called sternocleidomastoid muscle. Now, if they can't spell it, I said, as long as you're close, I'm fine with that. You get the concept. And so that, it's an exact science, anatomy and physiology is fact. But a lot of them have problems with just the spelling, but they get the concept. So,
Yeah.
how do we deal with that? That's
Right. So you're focusing really on the content
yes,
of your science course as opposed to everything relevant to writing.
yes. Unless I can't understand it at all, when they write out their answers. Oh, that either it's wrong or it's you haven't answered the question.
That was our table. I would say our table, that's how our purpose is we're looking for content. Like, yes, we'll, maybe comments about, that I was saying, I tell them, get a proofreader, go to the writing set or whatever, but maybe take 1 or 2 points off because we're looking for the content of the paper because we aren't English teachers or anything. And we recommended our conversation with them. And I'm intrigued to hear what you two think of this because this is your field. But like in 5-10 years, the kids, I would just say my son uses speech to text to write everything. Like that in a few years that the computers are going to literally write their papers for them with correct spelling, with correct grammar, and where does that go and how in grading papers?
Well, I use it, when I'm writing emails, I will do it, but you have to say new paragraph, period, yeah. So they still need to have the grammatical basics, yeah, behind them.
I have to say, it hurts my heart when they don't take the time and care to use spell check, grammar check. It just, I have trouble dealing with that. And, I'm in the education department. I don't take points off, but I do spend the time making corrections. I offer the option if they turn something in 3 classes or a week ahead of time. I'm more than willing to go through it. If it has earned a grade of an A or a B, I will accept it. Otherwise, I give it back and ask them to turn it in when it's due with those corrections. Kind of what I also already gave them. But if I tell them I'm taking points off for grammar, spelling, etc., then I do. Otherwise, I'm going to be strictly with the content. But I also suggest up front, use grammar check, use spell check. If you can't spell it, choose another word. Or turn it into an acronym.
These may be fighting words, I apologize, but I kind of ascribe to the idea that if there are so many distracting errors in a piece of writing, then I can't get to the content. I cannot understand what it is you're trying to say. And I do tell them that. Distracting errors, spelling, punctuation, word usage, caption.
all of those things if there are so many distracting errors, and I'm not gonna know what you're trying to say. So I do take off for grammar, and I don't hit them hard with it. I say grammar as an all-inclusive term, but, you know, I have to understand what it is you're trying to say. And if I'm distracted by all your errors, I'm not gonna know what it is that you're saying.
Christopher, you raising your hand.
Yeah, so I always like to play devil's advocate, but back to what Bridget said, you know, 5, 10, 15 years from now, like, we're already the dinosaurs in their eyes, right? That language is a living thing, and the usage of language is a constantly evolving thing. And so the way they use language in various technologies, right, will eventually modify what is correct, right? And so there are many times when I check myself and I realize, especially in my discipline, the majority of my students are DACA recipients. More than likely, English is not their first or primary language. And if their primary language was Spanish, it's a very phonetic, silent immigrant language, right? And so for them, spelling is more naturally vanilla. And so if I can sound it out and make sense of it, then I really don't belabor the spelling, because I remember spelling exams in elementary school and thinking this is the stupidest language on the face of the planet, right? Like, how can you have like the sound assignment be homonyms, right? You can come up with 3 words that all sound the same or sound different, mean different things. So I try to be, again, back to the content. If I can decipher it, let that be, because I do truly believe that sometime very soon people will like, really? You still use semicolons? Like, that's so 2000.
Yeah. You really make yourself stand out. So.
Yeah.
This is a little sidebar, but I know you're all content experts, and primarily you're looking for the content in the paper. You want to make sure that students are understanding the material. But our assessment person's in the room, and we've also been talking about general education outcomes. So at the same time, we're trying to help our students to think more critically. We're trying to help them to acquire academic literacy, all of these things that they'll need in the workplace. That is kind of a cursory goal of all of our courses. And I think what we're going to talk about today and some of the best practices will help you all kind of attend to, you know, the writing as you're engaging, as you're looking at the content of the paper, engaging students' understanding. Also be able to think critically and strategically about how can I help the students communicate this content that they understand more clearly or in a more sophisticated way that will help them, you know, in future careers or whatnot. So I think that's kind of where we're headed as we move forward. So.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is briefly hit on the research of this stuff. So I spent ungodly amount of time looking at all the research about comments on student writing, specifically through the lens of students' perception of those comments. You would not believe how much research is out there about this stuff. And so I spent an entire semester in grad school doing that. I will try to just tell you like in like 2 minutes. Mitchell, since my head swimming in it, Mitchell was so kind to put it in some bite-sized themes for y'all, with little citations to show that this is real, and we're academics here. Okay, one of the principles is the idea of comments as dialogue. And the idea, if dialogue seems funny because here you are in your office commenting on it, on the students writing, and they're not sitting there to talk back to you, it seems like a funny idea. Think of it this way, is that several students in several studies say, we don't like comments that end conversations or some variant of that. We like conversations comments that start conversations, comments that call us out to do something else with their writing. And so if you think of it this way, students need to be active participants in this back and forth we're having, even if they're not present to me physically, because otherwise maybe they're not even reading the comment or not doing anything with that comment. And so this kind of dialogical nature as opposed to a conversation ender. And we'll talk more specifically about strategies to do that. But that's kind of one of the principles that really pops up in a ton of the research about this stuff. Okay, second one. The idea of encouragement and praise and comments, which we heard so eloquently over here. The research talks about several positive aspects of praise and affirmation. And so I believe it's not just coddling students and treating them all special something, but there are really strong pedagogical reasons to do this. It builds their confidence, it rewards their hard work, it indicates to them what they're doing well so they can continue doing that. In a lot of the narratives where they ask students how they perceive comments from instructors, there is this whole dimension of, if I only get hard comments, I assume the instructor hated my paper, and that brings down their confidence. There's also this other dimension of, if there are areas of a paper where there are no comments, the student kind of resigns themselves to, it's okay, not good, just okay, I guess there's no problems, and they're not sure what to do with that information because there's a lack of it. So this idea of red is love, I like the idea of red is love, right? It actually fits really well with the research. So praise has a lot of positive aspects to it. Now, there's this area that comes up a lot in the research of the tension between praise and affirmation with clarity. Because there's one study in particular where students complained about the way the instructors were using praise and affirmation because they felt like it was mitigating the actual comment to try to protect their feelings and therefore making it unclear what the teacher actually meant. And so sometimes the positive stuff, the students like, okay, thanks, but what do you want me to do with this, right? And so specificity and clarity should indicate what's happening with the text specifically and what the student should do about it. And often as people with high-level degrees, we know that. We kind of assume a knowledge base about writing, and the student is a little lost about what they're supposed to do. Okay, one thing that comes up constantly in the research too is students just don't understand the comment. I don't even mean they don't know what to do with the comment. They can't read the comment, right? They can't read the comment. Often they can't read the comment because they can't read the handwriting. The comment's written. It's really amazing how many times students said this in the narratives. Also, some instructors will use symbols. I remember having English teachers who would have this whole library of editing symbols, and maybe that wasn't shared with the, or maybe I got a handout at the beginning of a class and I lost it, and then I was like, I don't know what these things mean at all, right? Or maybe we even use grammatical terms. Probably English teachers are more guilty of this, that we assume everyone knows. I write comment slides sometimes on papers, and students are like, I need to know any more comments. What does that mean? They don't know what that means. So students not understanding is a big thing. And then, of course, what do we want the students to do with the work, with the comments? What should their next steps actually be? One thing I'll say here that strikes me, there's a lot of research out there that comments actually don't help students at all. That feedback doesn't do anything, partially because they don't read it. And the reason they don't read it is because the class has been structured in a way where they're expected to do anything with the comments. Now, I think my assumption is you need this information about your own writing so you can carry it forward on the next project. There's a lot of barriers there where a student, sometimes emotionally, they look at the grade, the low grade, they're like, I don't even want to do this. So they don't look at the comments. Or they get a high grade and they're like, I did good. Don't look at the comments. And I'm crying because I just spent 14 hours. I'm a composition teacher who my entire job is writing comments on papers. Have them not read it feels really frustrating to me.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys can read this, but this is not surprising, but the research shows that students are much more likely to do something with your comment if it's on a draft of a paper that's going to be revised for a grade, and they're much less inclined to do anything with it if it's the final word in the paper when the paper's over. Right, so not surprising, but the research studies, many of them brought out that fact.
Totally. And another thing that pops up here, this is what I've learned, first-hand experience. if I have a paper and I want to say everything that's wrong with it, right? Meaning I write 200 grammar errors on it. And then I also have a big content note. And I say, okay, you can revise this and you'll get more credit. It's built into my course that you're going to use the comments for that part of the course grade. Students will go through and do all the grammar stuff. And I know some of us, we kind of correct it for them, right? Doing these track changes or something. So that's an easy fix. I already know what to do. But they'll ignore the content concern because they feel like I did a ton of work. Look, I went through every page and I did all this work, right? Turn it back in, I grade a final draft, it only bumps their grade up like 5 points. Because it's all within that little part of the grammar rubric. What happened? I spent all this time, I fixed the whole paper. But, so there's this, right, you see what I'm saying? So prioritizing concerns could really help them. Practices. So for that part, please, like, pitch in or tell us what you're doing, or if anything strikes you as a question or something that resonates with you, tell us.
So there are a lot of best practices that kind of emerge from a lot of the research that we talked about, but we're going to give you 6. And kind of the way this is going to work is I'm going to talk about a best practice or a strategy, and then Joe and I are going to illustrate that practice with a real life example, a comment that we've used in responding to our students' papers, so you guys kind of see what it looks like. The first one is this really basic idea of just engaging the writer personally. And so what we mean by that is a lot of us kind of teach the same courses, we use the same assignments every semester, so we kind of have this idea in our head, this like ideal student paper, right? And so we kind of recycle the comments that we give students on their papers, and we kind of have our evaluator hat on. But what we're really getting at here is to really respect the student as a writer who has a rhetorical purpose and something to say, right? So engaging the writer in that way and kind of taking off your teacher hat and just kind of putting on your reader hat, which is something else we'll talk about in a minute, but really engaging with the student's writing and engaging with the writer, with the student as a writer with a specific purpose in this paper. So what does that look like? Let's go to the next slide.
Here's the way that I start a paper. I say, hello, Gabby. One thing to know is that the student, you can't see the rest of the paper, but she wrote her name was Gabriella on the paper, but she's Gabby, so she's Gabby. Hello, Gabby. Thanks for sharing your rhetorical analysis. See my comments below, as always. Let me know any questions that arise, especially as you revise this for your portfolio. So, as a very brief illustration, just that I'm kind of setting the tone, that I'm talking to this person as an individual. Here's my secret. Don't tell anyone. I have a key command in my computer that says all of that stuff except for hello, Gabby. So, because I know you might be thinking, man, that would take a long time to learn to do all that stuff, right? But it's talking directly to the student, right? And as I go through my comments, I'm keeping the student in my mind. I actually struggle to teach online classes because I don't interact with her. But I think of her, where she's sitting, her demeanor, as an interpersonal communication, how she may react to the things that I say, and trying to engage in this way personally and with exactly what she's trying to say in her stance and her face.
So are you typing out all these comments or are you writing them out?
That's a good question. Yeah. So me, I type them.
So on a separate piece of paper, you're typing them, and then you're printing it out and adding it?
Good question. So this, for me, and I'm interested in how others do it in terms of the medium of commenting, but they turn them in on Blackboard, and I'm using Microsoft Word, and then I use the commenting feature there. So I had to zoom in on this comment so you could be able to read it from your seats, but you would the full picture, you would see their paper, and then all the comments lined up on the right side, pointing to the text that I was referring to.
Wait, so then you put it in Word, and then how do you get it back into Blackboard, or do you just print it and then?
I upload it back into Blackboard. There's like when I give I do my grade, and then there's an upload button where I can give them feedback. And I connect it as a link.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah. And you know what I just started doing recently? I used to connect it or send it back to them to Blackboard, upload it as a Word document. And then I found out a lot of the students are using their phones and can't. On their phones, sometimes they have a reader, but it doesn't show the comments. So now I'm saving them as PDFs because that seems to be better for the whole.
Sorry.
I was just gonna say, and you have little things and you save them somehow? And how, are you
Right, now
gonna
we
teach us how to do that?
So I thought about doing that, but this is not my computer, and I would have to like.
But there's actually a way you can say specific comments and then just adjust them.
Yes.
You could do it on what our students as Gmail.
So it's called key commands.
What's it called, key command?
Key commands. Do you do this?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Mine's too individualized and personal.
I know. See, think of it this way: teaching 6 classes of 5 papers. Yes, it's
Yeah.
so many.
So Joe teaches 6 classes. I just teach 1. I'm an adjunct. So I just teach 1 class in addition to my full-time job. So.
Yeah. Also, I would say this. What I found when I was typing everything is that I was spending so much time writing the same comment over and over and over and over, including a lot of praise comments. Like, this is really good because, it frees me up to be a lot more personal, actually. So I'll have one that I'll have like a positive thesis one that says this thesis is great because, and then I can just do that key command and then type out the personal stuff. Whereas before I was like, I can't have time to be really personal.
So another example of how you might do this, it goes back to this theme of treating comments as dialogue. So what some teachers do, and I've done this, is when your students turn their papers in, ask them to write you a little, like 1-paragraph cover letter. This is what I was trying to do with this paper. This is where I stumbled. This is what I struggled with. And this is what I think I did well. And so you're having a student start this conversation with you as the instructor. And then when you provide feedback, you engage with that cover letter. And you kind of use it to frame your comments or to tailor your comments. So that's just another little strategy. But this theme of dialogue and engaging with the writer as a person, not just a student who's like regurgitating content, is really prominent in the literature on commenting. And I think it makes a huge difference. And Joe talked about this earlier, but the research also shows that these comments really affect students emotionally. And they can either really build them up or really kind of be damaging. So that's a great way to kind of to make them feel comfortable and start the dialogue. So offer constructive feedback. This seems very obvious, but I think all of us, as having been students in the past, know that oftentimes feedback is not constructive. It often looks like it can often come in this form. Next slide. So how many of you have received comments like this in the past or give comments like this, right? Little phrases like awkward or question mark or an underline that you don't understand. This is not constructive. And students oftentimes don't understand this or they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, like what's the problem there? Like if you get that awkward comment, what are your questions that you would want to ask that teacher if they were standing there in front of you?
What bird are you?
Why is it?
What bird are you?
Yeah.
What bird is that?
Right. I have a confession. When I started teaching, I was teaching 8th grade, and I had to grade research papers, and I know I had seen that off thing a bunch of times from my own teachers, so I started writing off, and it was like I was a chicken, right? And they're 8th graders, everything's awkward the whole time. Like I can write that 20 times and it's totally accurate. It's awkward, but yeah. My questions would be, what bird are you? And what do you want me to do? And what's wrong with it? There's got to be a more specific way to describe the problem and to give me something to go on to fix it. So here's an example. I said for the student, I can see this as MLA. That's the most positive thing I can say. I can see it as MLA. But there are a few formatting issues. I say the formatting issues, double spacing, alphabetical order, capitals, formatting, and dates. Now, I could have stopped with, this is not MLA, right? I could have said, make this MLA, right? That would have made me feel good, like I did my due diligence maybe. But 2 ingredients I wanted to add. One is for this student in particular, more specificity about the parts of MLA that are missing. And then I honestly, as an interpersonal communication, didn't trust that just saying those words was really going to lead the student to revising it. So I did the link as a way to try to be as constructive as possible, but this is what you can do. So.
As practice number 3, this is my favorite one. Respond as a reader. So I alluded to this earlier. A lot of times we kind of have a teacher, evaluator hat on, and we kind of have maybe preconceived ideas of how we might comment on a student's paper, what feedback we might give to them. But this best practice asks you to just simply read your student's paper as you would read anything, right? And to engage with it in that way. And when your understanding breaks down, or when you're confused, or you're not sure what the student is trying to communicate, to just tell them, right? And to engage with them either in written comments or verbally, as Nancy talked about in class. Just tell them where your understanding is breaking down. And so this is important because a lot of times comments are kind of like final verdicts. This is confusing, or this paragraph should go here, or this is wrong, right? And students can be very dubious of these kinds of comments, right? Because they're taking many classes, they have many professors, and all the professors are telling them different things about what good writing should be, right? So you can be more truthful and more accurate if you just simply respond, for me, as a reader of your paper, this is what I experienced, right? I was confused here, and I wasn't sure what you were trying to say here. I thought you were going to say this, but then you went on and said this, and that confused me, right? So you're continuing this dialogue, and you're engaging like a reader. So here's an example from a comment that I gave a student. So here, what do you guys think of this? This is cliche and unclear. Please revise. Also, this paragraph should be in the beginning, not at the end. Is this responding as a reader, or is this a final verdict?
It's like a final verdict.
Final verdict, right? Saying this is wrong, right? Yeah. Whereas with some issues in some papers, people could disagree as to where the paragraph should go. So here's a better example. After reading this first sentence, I thought that you were going to give more examples of sources that state life begins at conception. But instead, you begin to discuss abortion laws, right? So I'm kind of engaging in this dialogue with the student as a reader. Hey, I'm confused. I thought you were going to go down this way, but instead you went this way, right? So it's continuing that conversation, and it really gives the student an idea of what the reader or you are experiencing as you read the paper. So.
Yeah, I find that for me, I use the phrase as a reader all the time. Like, for example, as a reader, the point you're making here, or as a reader, it's not clear to me how this point is connected to this point. That. Because any other way I would phrase it implies that they don't have an internal logic, there's not something they're trying to do, they're just wrong, kind of dumb. But I know they're trying to do it. I know they're trying to do something, so I can only really respond from the words that I have in the page in front of me. There it is. It is on here. As a reader, I'm having trouble understanding the connection between the location of this beautiful place on the ocean to this quote and analysis of the color red. I love the analysis in the student paper so much, and so this disconnect just like killed me, you know. And that's why I can only respond with what I was seeing. It would clarify this section to elaborate on that connection you are seeing for us readers. Okay. All about the readers.
No, I just want to comment on this because, you know, with the GED, these are some really low-level students. I mean, like getting a paragraph is not easy on some of the students. Yeah. And so sometimes I'll start reading and there's so many mistakes that you were talking about that it's like I cannot deal with it. Yeah. So I stop, and then I like to read the whole thing. What are they really trying to say to me without trying to look at all their literally 40, 50, 60 mistakes? And then I feel more positive because what they were trying to express was certainly better than what they put on paper. Okay? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think there's an article here that we're going to pass out at the end, but one of the suggestions in the article is to withhold any commentary until you get to the end of the paper. Yeah. Right? Because we're going to talk about being strategic and just identifying one or two things to address in a paper, and you can't do that until you've gotten through the whole thing. So.
That's true. I definitely been guilty of making comments preemptively, then having to go back and be like, oh, I gotta delete that now, because now I see what you're trying to do, like, and like the classic one is, give more evidence for this, and then I get to the next paragraph, I'm
It's all
like,
there.
there's the evidence, okay, thank you. So it's really helpful to read through. Next one.
Okay, focus on a writer's goal. You want to take this one?
Sure. So here's the idea. The writer has a goal, right? Sometimes if we are responding very prescriptively and with absolute terms, we are acting like there's just correct. My mother always said, are you correcting papers? And I'm not like, are you marking papers or like responding, are you correcting papers? Which implies there's just this correct, incorrect, like a math problem. And sometimes I might like that, but my discipline's not that cut and dry. So I'm responding as someone who's helping a person articulate what they want to articulate, right? Now, often that goal is given to me by the assignment itself. So if it's write a persuasive paper, I can make the assumption that their goal is to persuade me of something. So here's just my example to kind of illustrate it. And I'll tell you that in the last few years, there's been a proliferation of insults that students write in academic essays. It probably has something to do with our discourse as a country. Maybe they're taking in way too much cable news. I don't know. But I think that students think like, if I'm going to show I'm really passionate about this topic, I got to hurl an insult at someone. I got to show how the other side's so dumb or so evil, right? That's just like a thing. And it bothers me because rhetoric is about civil discourse. Right? So this person hurled an insult at the president. And it would have been easy for me to say, stop insulting people. Or this isn't appropriate for a paper, something like that, right? But so I tried to frame it in terms of their goal. Their goal is to persuade people that the president's policies are not positive ones. And so I said, since your goal is this, to persuade readers that Trump's policies are damaging to Americans, it's counterproductive to call him a moron. That, and I imagine the student being like, well, why? It's true or something, you know, like that. That would make his supporters or people on the fence mad at you, and therefore much less willing to hear your evidence. I hope that explanation rings true, and I think it would, because we do talk about these types of concepts in class about civil discourse and the emotional impact of rhetoric and things. So to always put it on back to their goal and help them see how it might be affecting readers who don't have the same assumptions that they have, I think it's really, really helpful.
Okay, the next one, balancing affirmation with criticism. Could you go to the example?
Yeah.
So one of my students was writing a paper on why second language classes should be required in K-12 education programs. And but in her introduction, she didn't really tell the reader where she was going, right? So this was my comment. This is a good introduction. So some affirmation there. I thought it was pretty good, but it was missing what I thought was a key component. So then I said, perhaps you could add the question about K-12 education in the intro as well, just so that readers know that you will discuss the K-12 requirement in the paper. So it's just the idea. Students really, really value and appreciate positive feedback. So it's just good to balance whatever criticism or constructive feedback you have with praise, just to let them know you're doing this really well, continue doing this, but here's something that you could add to make this better. So oftentimes we can just kind of get in this mode of correcting and writing constructive negative feedback. So it's really good to balance it with positive.
Yeah, and I just want to say, it's not so much about protecting the students' emotions, so they don't, I mean, if there's too much, they will check out, but it's not so much about that for me as it is actually pointing out where they're coming from. Because a less astute commenter, like sometimes me when I'm in a bad mood, might have left off that first part and just said, add a question about K-12 education here, right? This student takes that as, this was really a bad intro, and I just need to do this thing. It kind of changes the conversation about the writing to, not that I've done something and there's an improvement to make, to I just have to do something to, like, please my teacher, right? It kind of takes that ownership away from the student.
Okay, so our last strategy here relates to Nancy's comment, prioritize the most important issues. So One of our recommendations is not to be comprehensive in your feedback or in your comments for students, but to be strategic. Right? There are a number of things that you can comment on in any paper, and there are so many errors and mechanical issues that you could address. But students probably are not going to make all those corrections or address all of those concerns. And we know that research shows us if they're not going to have to revise the paper, they're probably not going to do anything, right? So to increase the likelihood that they'll do something with your comments, it's good to just provide or hone in on one or two aspects of the paper that they can work on to improve it. So here is an example of what that might look like. So when I comment on papers, I use like this combination of marginal comments and an end note, right? So I'll use, in Word, I'll use Word's comment feature, and so I'll use marginal comments. They're usually short, like the ones we've been showing. And then at the end, I'll write the student a note. And so this student's paper was about requiring a foreign language class in K through 12. And after reading her whole paper, which was, this is a Japanese student, which was really, to be perfectly honest, like riddled with errors and grammar mistakes. And I commented maybe on one or two of those, but these are the two things I decided she could work on the most. This basically says, your introductory paragraph was strong, yet as written, it didn't give the reader any idea that the paper is about the necessity for foreign language learning in the K-12 setting. Here are some things you can do to improve the intro. And then the second thing, I think it's important to qualify your argument. Are you talking about all K through 12 systems in the world, or just the United States K through 12? You should qualify your argument, and if you do that, you can cite more specific evidence, compare different countries, etc. So the idea is that after having read her whole paper, I could decide what are the two things that it needs the most, and just tell her both of those. And as you can see, like the way that these comments are framed, good job. The paper is well organized, well sourced, and has a clear claim. So there's the positive, right? And then here's kind of the constructive. And then again, great work. Please let me know if you have any questions. And then sign off. So I don't expect that all comments would be this long.
You're a rock star.
No, but the idea is that you just kind of focus on one or two things, really. So
I have a question. What would happen if you read the student's paper and there were so many grammar errors in the intro that you couldn't really tell what she was saying?
This is the question for me?
Yeah.
Would
that change this?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So I could kind of understand from reading her introduction where she was going, but I had to do a little bit of work, right? Which is why I was like, you should be more specific. But if it was so full of grammar errors, then one of my main points of constructive feedback would probably address grammar, right? Because the paper is just kind of incomprehensible. So these are more global concerns, right? I'm not addressing any surface features in this. But if that were the case, one of them would have to do with the actual language.
Yeah, that's what I would do too. I suspect it would be similar in that when I see a paper, even teaching the credit level 101 or 102, occasionally I'll see a paper where I really cannot understand what's being argued because of the grammar issue. You kind of alluded to that earlier. And so in that case, which is relatively rare for me, but in that case, that will be my priority. And I'll make a long note about it, not just go through and say fragment, comma, slice, fragment, comma. Like I won't, instead of overwhelming them with that, I will do a fair bit of that. Often, if I'm overwhelmed by it, and I think this is so many grammar errors, the student will never look through and correct all these, I'll do the first page of the paper to demonstrate how bad it is in case they don't know.
You'll make
a note.
You'll correct
the same thing. I do the first page, then I make a note, and I'm like, it was so bad I couldn't answer.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I don't know it that way, but.
Take this crap.
So, yeah, I have like two things. If it's so bad that I can still understand the content enough that I want to comment on the content, I'll say there are so many, I need to stop correcting these now so I can give you feedback on the content. But please proofread throughout the entire paper.
Have you talked to your writers?
So you would have actually like corrected a portion of it,
I would do a portion of it.
and then you would say at this point, okay.
That's right. That's right. And I guess my thinking about that is, if I don't do any of it, the student will say, "You said I had a lot of these things, but I don't."
They don't care.
I don't understand why I didn't go.
Right. And so I guess my theory there is if they come back to me in person in my office hours, we can just start attacking whatever you commented on. But if I just can't comprehend any of it, then the note's going to be very different. The note is going to be, I cannot even understand your argument because there's interference from the grammar.
Yeah.
That's a much different conversation.
You know, I had a professor in college write on my paper, a paper that I turned in, of an error that I had been consistently making. And he said, I'm going to stop correcting this now, but you need to correct it further on. You know, that made me more, I had to look for it then.
Yeah.
You know, so I actually learned something from
Right.
the process rather than just, oh, I gotta fix this. You know?
That's an excellent point. This is like a whole nother conversation and presentation, but the goal is that students learn, right? That's the goal of all of this, right? That they learn the grammar rule or whatever it is they need to make the correction. And there's not a really great evidence that correcting every error for them and correcting all of them helps them learn, right? So I think the best practice is identifying the error, but not telling what it should be, and then incentivizing them going back to it, figuring out what it should be and correcting it with a grade or tying that into the course somehow, and being really strategic about which ones that you target. That can really produce learning. But if you're just completely comprehensive and you correct everything and you tell them what it should be, they're probably not going to learn from that, and they're probably not going to get much out of it.
Like, sweet, I have an editor.
Right.
Great. Thanks. Yeah.
Has there been any research done on the evolution of language as it's today, what we hear today? For example, someone might say, I graduated high school, but I know back in the quote old days, I was told graduate from high school, but now it kind of proliferates all over the place. You hear it on television everywhere. I graduated college, graduated high school, but not graduated from high school, but graduated from. So when did that change? But I noticed I see that a lot.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when you talk about prepositions like that, like I think there also used to be a higher emphasis on never-ending sense with a preposition, and now I think we all just do it. Even in Chicago, we say things like "want to come with," and that's like okay, not with me, but just come with. I wonder if there's this overall trend of less formality in some of those words like prepositions. I don't know what your experience is. My experience is something like that. Usually I have so much to address on a paper, I wouldn't even comment on it. Only if the student had everything else just perfect and they are the kind of student that really wants that kind of fine grain.
Yeah. There.
Mitch, in the example a couple slides ago where you said you give the affirmation and the criticism,
Yeah.
you have no forwardship. There we go. Your criticism is in the form of a question.
Yeah.
Was that a conscious thing? Is that something you want to employ to give criticism in the form of question soften it? Or was it just an unconscious way that you phrased it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's purposeful for two reasons. So I want to make sure this writer has autonomy and like you can make the decisions like about your introduction. Like maybe she doesn't agree with me, which I want to give her permission to do, and we can have that conversation. And then the second reason is really to soften it, which is that's probably the primary reason. I don't want to tell her, put this in there. I want to suggest it, and the question mark makes it a little softer. I think that was probably my intention.
So that's a good strategy to employ then in giving.
Yeah, I think some questions, what do you think, Joe? Like, I think some students don't know what to do with certain questions. Like short questions like, what do you mean here? I think that could be confusing to a student. But I think questions that have more information in them that actually give students some direction are helpful. But questions that are just kind of short, terse, might not be helpful to students because they don't know what to do with those questions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think this question gives some direction.
Yeah.
A question that's open, like working in the writing center and being a tutor, sometimes instructors would write on paper something like, can you give more evidence here, question mark? And the student kind of looks at it like, are they telling me to give more evidence, or are they just asking a genuine question of if that's possible? And so that can, softening it in that way can create maybe some lack of clarity.
That right there kind of goes to like the teacher-student relationship versus the writing center, like the peer-to-peer relationship. Like from the teacher relationship, they're like, oh, if the teacher asks if I can get more evidence, then more evidence. But if you're doing it as a tutor, it's more like, no, like legitimately, can you? Can you not? Like you're really trying to like ask them legitimately.
Right. And they say no, it's like, well, please do it anyway, because your teacher wants you to do it. Let's figure out a way here, let's figure out a way. But yeah, and there is a tension there, right, between softening it with questions or with more conversational, interpersonal ways of communicating, and making a clear comment about expectations as the instructor in that particular question.
What do we have next, Joe?
I have a question. Well, it's a question for you all, and the question is, how do you comment, like physically? Pen on paper? Microsoft Word? What do you do? What works for you in that way? Pen on paper? Who's pen on paper? Let's just get like a survey. Okay. Who does some sort of electronic format? Okay.
We're starting to.
Okay, so anyone, why do you do the way that you do it? What are like the benefits of that way?
I find just old school pencil paper, I just feel it's more, how do I say it? It's more intimate. Does that make sense? Like when I look at stuff like this, it's to me, right, it's cold, it's not there. It's not personal. That's how I look at it. It's old school when I look at it. Handwriting.
I get pen on paper because I can do it anywhere in the world.
That's true, right? That's true.
Great point.
If I were to do it that way, when I do pen on paper, I'm doing it as I'm doing it. If I were to do that, I would probably feel obligated to do it twice. Go back, make my notes by hand, and then go back and enter them.
Got it.
So to be real honest, I'd rather do it once than 2 or 3 times.
I'm grading papers right now, and I did it all pen to paper, and now I'm sitting at my computer going in and making like when I'm grading them, I have the section and I'm writing all from the paper into the computer, typing the copies.
Got it.
So.
So who does electronic format? Maybe either on Microsoft Word or on Google Doc? Yeah,
I just do it in Blackboard. I've been using their little editing tools.
Yeah, that's right. And I feel like I didn't have time to show you all these different tools, but just a lot of people don't know in Blackboard can you highlight terms and do a comment, or is it just kind of like
You just click on it and it does like a bubble, kind of like how Word does. Yeah. I don't know if you can highlight it. I don't remember. But I have to say in the comments under the grade though, see my notes in your paper because they're not going to open it up and look. And that's another thing. I'm always like, how do I know if they even looked at all this?
Exactly. And because I'm uploading a document, it shows up in the comments. Even my students sometimes don't look at it until it's like, do your portfolio, you have to now.
Yeah. I think how much time would you all say you spend on each paper?
Too much.
I mean,
Like 15 or 20 minutes?
It should be fair.
Depends on what the paper is.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what it is, but if they spend the time to give me what I'm asking for, I need to be fair and give them the time
Right.
that they deserve. So
Yeah.
it could be 15, it could be 5 minutes, it could be 35 minutes.
Yeah, the reason I asked that is we all spent a ton amount of time on this, so we really want it to be worthwhile. So I'd encourage any way you can incentivize revision and engagement with your comments in your class, do that, right? The cover letter thing I suggested, or if a student has to revise a paper, ask them, what did you revise and why? These kinds of questions. What did you do with my feedback? But I think it's good for learning and engaging with the material, but also so we know, like, why are we spending all this time commenting on student papers? We want it to be more than just justifying a grade.
Totally. And my students do portfolios, so they can't redo a paper for a different grade, but at the end they do a portfolio, so they're choosing some of their papers, and they have to engage with my comments. That's a huge part of that process. Here's something radical. Anyone want to be a radical innovative educator? Because this is a big takeaway I learned from the research about student perception. They love, almost without hesitation, comments that are done in audio form. You guys ever heard of this or done this before?
No.
So this is what I learned. Back in like the 80s, there were composition instructors who were using cassette tapes to record themselves talking about their students' papers and like giving them that'd be a lot of cassette tapes to buy. But now it's actually lucky. So the research shows that it's not great, obviously, if you're going to try to hit all the grammar issues. But any global concern, students report that they feel like it's personal and intimate, as you talked about with handwriting. They find that a lot more information can be communicated in a short amount of time. They find that the inflection of your voice actually communicates a lot that the writing doesn't. They can picture you as an individual, and they can tell from the attitude of the way you're speaking as much as they can from the literal words. And the good thing is that now, if anyone uses Google Docs, there's a little add-on. It's called Kaizena. I couldn't demonstrate it because of this computer. It's called Kaizena. Kaizena. It's a little tiny add-on. It'll take a few minutes to download, and it will, just like in Microsoft Word, you can make your written comments in the margin. It allows you to record spoken comments in the margin. Google Docs. Google Docs. So it would require a student to submit a paper on Google Docs, which could be a link. If you use Blackboard, it could be a link in Blackboard. So that's out there. Another way that some instructors have started doing comments on papers is with screen capture software. So the big program is called Camtasia, but there's a free version called Jing, J-I-N-G, that will let you do 5-minute videos. It's really nice because maybe you don't want to spend more, make a longer video than that on a paper anyway. But so what they do is what the student will get is a video file, and they see their paper on your computer screen, then they hear your audio talking about. So I've used this for grading portfolios before, because my students, they make these websites where they're showcasing their work. It doesn't give me the ability to comment in writing. I wouldn't watch any of it. It's a cumulative type of thing. But a real short video kind of walking through their portfolio on my screen and talking about it is a really, really nice way to assess it. So, yeah.
And I have a question. Sometimes I get just, write a summary of something. So I'm still learning to write a summary. And it takes so long to correct papers that sometimes I'm just reading it and determining without a lot of corrections, was just the content okay? And I think that's okay, but I don't know if it's okay. But it's like, if I had to go through every single thing that they do is writing it, I don't have enough time to do that. Does that make sense to just say that, you hit on the main points and not have to correct anything? I feel like I'm cheating them, but it's like, I can't do it all.
Right. To me, that sounds like what Mitchell was saying about prioritizing the main issues in paper. Yeah.
And it's really clear that students become better writers by writing extensively, not by making corrections that teachers gave. Right? So I think we don't need to be grading everything that students do. There's a lot of free writing that goes on in class, and we don't get to look at all of it, and I think that's fine.
Yeah.
That's how students learn, by doing.
Yeah, and that can get you off the hook a little bit, guilt wise, because it's really true. The act of writing and reading on its own, without anyone telling them that things are wrong, actually improves writers dramatically. The research says it improves them more than stacks and grammar worksheets in terms of incorporating it into their actual writing. So, yeah, I like it. I mean, I think you'd just be thinking like, okay, if a course learning outcome is grammar, does that mean every assignment you give has to have that goal? Probably not, right? Like, you can have different goals for different assignments. So, and if it's not grammar, like the science and math books, then even more.
And it's also low stakes in class writing is good for students. Like writing that the teacher will not grade, they just know I'm going to do this writing here. No one's going to see it. That is very good for students. So.
I think we have to let you go. Timelines?
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Really valuable.
Thank you so much for coming. And we would love if you email us with things. Here's our, we have references too if you wanted the presentation for some of the research, but for now I'll put that up there in case you want to email us for that or for anything else.
So when are you gonna do a course on all these cool tools?
Yeah.
I'd be here in a heartbeat, yes.
It would be
Yeah.
very
We'll talk. That'd be fun. Yeah, I realized that like demonstrate, because I've done ones where I demonstrate tools for creating portfolios, and it takes so long to walk through the technology. So we'll do a whole one on that. That sounds really
Great.
nice. Yeah.
Seriously, I would love that.
Okay.
Because
Well,
I'm
Lauren's
used to
in the federal
changes
thing, so it's
before,
not-
but I need a refresher on that, but you've got all this new, really cool stuff.
Yeah.
Look for the spring catalog.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you guys so much.